All right. The book of Daniel. We finished Zechariah. You got to back up in my Bible about 100 pages, 150 pages. The book of Daniel. We got a little bit of an intro. We'll tell you a few things about it, kind of set the stage of what's going on from a historical standpoint, cultural standpoint, standpoint of the nation of Israel, before we open up and start actually reading chapter 1. The papers that I gave you will be when we start reading chapter 1, we'll follow along. And I know some of the stuff that's there will kind of help you as we read through it with some little explanations on some of the verses. It's not every single verse, but it's all the really ones that are highlighted for the meaning. Who's Daniel? Well, he was a very young Jewish captive. If you remember when we studied the history, we studied all the kings, you remember that ultimately the Babylonians came and conquered Judah. The Assyrians had already taken out the northern kingdom, which left the southern kingdom, and when they still didn't do what God told them to do, even though he kept sending them prophet after prophet after prophet, God sent the Babylonians to punish them. To the wrath of God, he used the Babylonians to exert it. Daniel was captured by Nebuchadnezzar, and he's going to come up in a couple of these chapters, a big, long, fancy name. On the test, you will need to know how to spell that. So in 605, some very important things happened. The Babylonian kingdom kind of just exploded. It kind of grew up almost out of nowhere. The Assyrians were in power, but like most world powers, they basically got so corrupt and cared about themselves so much, and their morals fell so much that they pretty much started to decay from the inside. Their government became corrupt. They didn't care for their people. All these things happened, and as they started to crumble from the inside, it was a perfect time. The Babylonians came in and started to conquer them. At that point in time, Egypt said, well, whoa, we don't like these Babylonian guys. And they could see that the Assyrians were on their way out. So the Egyptians said, we're going to go up and we're going to help what's left of the Assyrians. And if we can join together, then we can beat the Babylonians. And the Egyptians said, and we'll leave Assyria there kind of as a buffer to watch over and protect us. Remember, at that point in time, Israel was not a concern to them as far as a world military power. And so in 605, the Egyptians marched up and they were going to take out the Babylonians and join up with the Assyrians. On their way, as they passed by Palestine, the last righteous king of the southern kingdom, Josiah, he decided he'd go out and beat the Egyptians because he didn't want the Egyptians to join up with the Assyrians. And he was mortally wounded in combat and died. The last godly king probably stuck his nose into business where he shouldn't have. So with the Egyptians, they get almost there, the Babylonians come down and they meet, and there's a big battle in 605. And the Egyptians were soundly defeated, even though they had great numbers, but they were soundly defeated, which left the door wide open. The Assyrians were no problem, the Egyptians were no problem, and as God orchestrates and he raises up kings and he raises up nations and he brings them down, it opened the way for the Babylonians just to march right on down, and within a couple months, they were there besieging Jerusalem. Now, the kings kind of all fell apart, and when the Babylonians took over Jerusalem the first time, they put in their little puppet rulers. But to make sure that everybody knew what was going on and who was boss, they took a lot of the implements, the vessels, out of the temple. All the golden vessels that they had that they used for their sacrifices and stuff. And they had lots and lots of vessels. So they took that stuff and they took it out. And when they left, they also took a whole bunch of young fellows. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Daniel was one of those young fellows. Nebuchadnezzar had to come back. The Babylonians had to come back 3 times because every time they would attack and put Jerusalem in its place, put in a little puppet ruler. They would get a year down the road, and they'd turn around and they'd try to make a deal with another power to beat the Babylonians. The Babylonians would find out, come back down, besiege them again, take a bunch more stuff. And each time it got a little more drastic. They put in another guy, and he decided to make a deal. The third time they came back was the end. That was it. This book covers about 70 years of the life of Daniel. Most likely he was in his early teens. I'm going to say probably maybe 14 or 15 when he was taken captive. And he lived, and we know as we get through, we get towards the chapters, we know the times when certain kings were in power, and it talks about him serving these other kings. He actually served 3 different kings. Contemporaries of Daniel were Jeremiah and Habakkuk and Ezekiel. Matter of fact, in Ezekiel, 3 times in the letter of the book of Ezekiel, he references Daniel. So Daniel went first, and Daniel went into captivity. Ezekiel was taken captive on the second round. When they came back the second time, they took Ezekiel, but he kept writing as well. Jesus even talks about Daniel. When he's talking about the end times at the end of Matthew, I think chapter 24, he starts talking about the abomination of desolation that the prophet Daniel wrote about. So Jesus uses the prophecies of Daniel. Daniel is one of the 3 major portions of biblical prophecy. You have Daniel, you have Revelation. Matter of fact, some people have said Daniel is the revelation of the Old Testament. And then probably Ezekiel is there, but there's also a lot of stuff that is in Zechariah. But just from the sheer quantity, probably Ezekiel would be the other of the 3 major portions of biblical prophecy. In the book of Daniel, there is more information about the Antichrist than anywhere else in the Scriptures. And you would think that would all be in Revelation, and there certainly is some stuff in there. But there's also things that Paul wrote about in 2 Thessalonians, and there's a lot of little bits and pieces. But the major teachings about the Antichrist will come across in the book of Daniel. Someone has said that Daniel is the key to understanding biblical prophecy. The book of Revelation, people say, is so hard to understand. And they use a lot of figures and things like that. But there's not one single thing in the book of Revelation that cannot be explained in other places in Scripture. So Revelation either explains itself or it refers to something else that was in the Old Testament. That's why Revelation is at the end. It's the culmination. It's the end. Don't need to know no more. That's it. And a lot of places in Revelation say, well, I wonder what the stars mean. You read 2 more verses, and the stars are, okay. So either Revelation describes itself, or it refers to something. And a lot of the somethings in the Old Testament come from the book of Daniel. Divided into 3 sections. Some people have it in halves. Some people kind of fiddle around with it. The very beginning is kind of like the introduction. Chapter 1 is like the general introduction. Maybe even 1 and 2. And you'll see why when we get to that. But then you have from 3 through 6 are called the stories. And these are the stories that we all know, we learned in VBS. Daniel in the lion's den, all right, that's in there. The 4 Hebrew boys in the fiery furnace, that's in there. What else is in there? Oh, the transformation that turned Nebuchadnezzar, this mighty king, right, into an animal out in the eating grass, and then God changed him back. So there's a lot of stories that we're going to find in those chapters. And then the last part, from 7 to 12, are the biblical prophecies. Again, we're going to have some prophecies in chapter 2, but they will be explained and built upon in the latter part of the book of Daniel. So the purpose of the book of Daniel. First of all is to give the assurance to the Jews during their time of punishment. Imagine you're one of the Jewish nations. The Babylonians have come. The Assyrians have already taken out all the northern kingdom, those 10 tribes. And now the last 2 tribes, they've been captured and taken. And Jerusalem has been destroyed and torn down, and everything has been taken and looted, and there's nothing left. And you're now living in some foreign land somewhere, serving some foreign king, and you're wondering, was that it? Is God finished with the Jewish people? What's going to happen next? Matter of fact, Daniel's going to ask that question a couple of times as he goes along. But God gives this book through Daniel to explain to the Jews and give them some encouragement that Israel, he's not finished with Israel. He's not done. And their time of punishment is only 70 years. We're going to find a point in when Daniel goes, he pulls out Jeremiah, and he goes, he's reading where God said that the captivity would only be 70 years. And he reads it and he goes, oh wow. He gets his little iPhone out and checks his calendar. And he goes, oh my gosh, we're almost at 70 right now. This must be it. This must be the end. God is about to do something major. So 70 years, God wanted them to have that encouragement as they're scattered all throughout the other civilizations. Also, the book of Daniel points out and reminds us time and time again that God is sovereign. He is always in control, even during their time of chastening. And we're going to see the hand of God. In chapter 1, we can see all these things that are happening. We can see it happened because God made this happen. This happened because God made that happen. And also it provides the revelation to the reader concerning the time of the Gentiles. The time of the Gentiles. From the time that the Babylonians, from the time that the Babylonians conquered and destroyed Jerusalem, that kind of started this time of the Gentiles. This means no longer will Israel be a major player. They will be under the rule and control of one major Gentile nation after another. They have never come back to their glory and to be what they were back then, which was a major world power. And you started off, you've got the Babylonians, and then right behind them you got the Greeks, you got the Medes and the Persians, and then you got the Greeks, and then you got the Roman Empire. And so we are now living in the time of the Gentiles that started when the Messiah was rejected. So even though after the Babylonians and God gathered them back and they rebuilt everything, they still rejected the Messiah. And so God then began to send out the disciples and send them out to the Gentiles. Preach the gospel to the Jews first and then to the Gentiles. Paul was an apostle to the Gentiles, though he still preached to the Jews. God then began to send the gospel message. And nations, Gentile nations, have ruled over Jerusalem since then. God is explaining about the time of the Gentiles and when that will end. And that will end when Christ comes again. Some of the critics of Daniel, they say that Daniel is just a bunch of myths and stories for children. We mentioned some of the stories, and there's cute little stories about the lion's den and all these other things, But these are just these can't be fact, and it can't be fact because of all the great miracles and prophecies that are made by Daniel. So they say that it can't be true. It can't be a true book. It must have been written by a man and not by God. And they say, well, since nobody could predict history so exact as Daniel, it must have been written in the 2nd century after all the stuff had already happened. And then they just post-dated it, predated it. And so the critics say that. And they also say that God does not give man supernatural revelation. So these are the critics. So anybody who discounts or dismisses the book of Daniel also rejects a literal view of the Bible. They reject the possibility of prophecy, of God telling man something in advance, that that's not even a possibility. And they reject the fact that God can't and won't do anything supernatural in and through mankind. And they reject the fact that God is absolutely omniscient and He has foreknowledge of all events. And because of that, they just say, well, there's just no such thing as miracles. The book of Daniel is the most complete prophetic book in Scriptures. It traces the plans of God for both the Jewish people and the Gentile people, from Babylon all the way up to the culmination of ages and the second coming of Christ. It is all laid out, primarily through a series of visions that God will give Daniel. All right, that's the background. Let's start in chapter 1. Again, where we are right now, you have to realize Israel had forsaken God's law. They had disregarded the Sabbath. One of the important things, one of the 10 Commandments dealt with the Sabbath. And one of the things of the Sabbath was every 7 years you had to let the land lay and then come back. And they didn't do that. They didn't honor God by keeping that Sabbath. This will come up later. We'll discuss that later. In chapter 9, this comes to a point. Also, they had fallen into idolatry. If you remember all of our studies about the kings, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, Chronicles, about all the idolatry and false worship. They ignored all of the prophets. We looked at all of those minor prophets, and they just wouldn't believe any of them. And basically, there was just a general decline of morals. Most of these minor prophets talked about that, and corruption in the legal system, and judges, and everybody taking care of, taking advantage of poor people, and so that came up time and time again. And so God sends Babylon. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, this is one of the kings that the Babylonians had put in place. He was supposed to run the vassal state, but he didn't. And so Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem and he besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. This is a sovereign work of God. You know, God had several times in the past, no matter what the odds were, had saved Jerusalem against attackers. And this one, it says, no, God just gave them over. He gave Nebuchadnezzar the victory. He called him, he sent him. Remember, there's some of the minor prophets. God says, you're not going to believe what I'm getting ready to do, but I'm calling a major nation to send them. And he's talking about the Babylonians. So God gave them into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar and to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Again, the Lord gave, the Lord gave, the Lord gave. Again, the sovereignty of God. Shinar. Anybody ever remember where the first time we read about Shinar? Go way back. Way back.
Genesis.
Genesis. Didn't go any further back than that. Matter of fact, it's in the 10th chapter of Genesis. Remember a little thing called the Tower of Babel? That was on the plains of Shinar. And the Tower of Babel is the location where eventually Babylon would have their headquarters, or the central part. That would be the central place. It's hard to imagine, but if you look at a map, Jerusalem is like right here. And then you've got this huge desert. And then right over here, about 900 miles away, is Babylon. So it's not like they're right next door to each other. And to get from one to the other, the Babylonians, they didn't cross the desert, they would go up, follow the Euphrates River, go all the way up. By the way, right up at that peak, that's where that major battle was, Carchemish against the Egyptians. And you got to come all the way back down the Euphrates River to get there. See, it was a long trip to get there. But God called them to come over and to conquer them. When they got there, they besieged it, and they took a bunch of stuff out of the temple. Nations would do that, and it was kind of like proving that my God can beat your God. So in one country, when a nation would beat another nation, they would go and take things out of their temple, and they would take it back home with them and put it in and offer it and give it to their gods in their temple. And then they go conquer somebody else and bring their stuff and put it in. It was just kind of a way of bragging, for lack of a better term. Their principal and primary god of the Babylonians is a god by the name of Marduk. That will not be on the test. Okay. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his official, that's Nebuchadnezzar, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles. Chief of the officials. Who's got a King James in here? Who's reading King James? You have eunuch?
Eunuch.
Yeah. Eunuch.
Master of the eunuchs.
Yeah, he's in charge of the eunuch. The phrase chief of officials is the same word for eunuch, because a lot of times they were, but not necessarily had to be, but it's the same word. So he was the head. He was the main guy that the king relied on. He sent him out and said, listen, I want you to bring a bunch of those captives, those young captives that we had, and these would have been young men, and again, in their early to mid-teens, 13, 14, 15. And it says that these teens came from the royal family and from the nobles. So when they conquered Jerusalem, instead of killing them all, they said, well, I'm going to take your teenage son, and I'm going to take your teenage son, and I'm going to take your teenage... And they went through and they picked a whole bunch and took them back to Babylon. Why did they pick them, do you reckon?
They were young and pliable.
Young and pliable? How come they don't get some guy working out in the field? Some of them guys in the palace and the royalty, they may have been kind of sissified. I don't know.
Maybe indoctrinated.
Doctrine. They would have already been educated to a point. And God uses worldly education to prepare leaders. Remember Moses? 40 years he was prepared in Egypt before he rebelled and left. But that learning, that schooling, and he learned a lot about the Egyptian gods, and that came into play when he kept showing up to Pharaoh, going, let my people go. And each of the curses was a curse directed towards a different Egyptian god. And so God uses this education. Yes. Here's the other thing. Kind of like insurance policy. I've got 500 young men of all the royal families and predominant families. I would strongly suggest you not have an uprising or try to do something behind my back, because guess who the first ones are going to get it? So it's a type of insurance policy. But like Joel said, these would have been the more educated, and this is what they're getting ready to do. They've got to reboot these kids, but they've already got a good foundation. You know, they may have already known things about math, and they may have already probably knew a few languages, and so they already had been schooled, and so that was very valuable. Look at what it says about these young men. Youths in whom there is no defect, who were good looking, they had never picked me, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, which goes to your point, Joel, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving in the king's court, and he ordered him to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. Here's the qualifications. Had to be young and teachable. Isn't it true? The older we get, the harder it is for us to learn. The old dog, new tricks. We get set in our ways and our mindset. You have to get them young, get them while they're pliable. Not necessarily physically, but mentally. Good looking, no physical defects. He didn't want people in there hobbling around, or, people had a bad hand or withered hand. He didn't want any of that kind of stuff, because they were going to be serving in the king's court. They were training them to be not necessarily ambassadors, but officials. And so as you conquer the world, you can rely on your pool, or you can go out as you conquer all of these different nations and take the cream of the crop and bring them in and indoctrinate them and have them serve you. Now you've got a much wider field to choose from. They had to be well-rounded. They had to know a lot about a lot of different things. And they had to have previous noble training. And what that means is they had to know how to act in and around royalty, around kings, how to behave. When the king walks in, they wouldn't be going, "Hey, sup?" They would know to bow. They would know the cultural things. They would know how to treat. And so these were the young men that they selected. These were some of and they were to learn, it says, the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. The language and literature of the Chaldeans. They already knew the Jewish literature. Since they were able to attend synagogue, they had been in synagogues and they knew scriptures. They probably knew Jewish Hebrew, most likely also knew Aramaic, which was the Greek. And matter of fact, that is going to be very important in a couple chapters. Maybe next week. And so they already knew certain things, but now they've got to learn the Babylonian language. The word used a lot of times for Babylonians was Chaldeans. It can be used interchangeably, but most likely what it's talking about here is while Chaldeans are Babylonians, not every Babylonian is a Chaldean. They were a special group, almost like a separate priesthood or a group of wise men. And these were the ones who attended to the king, the Chaldeans. And matter of fact, later, if you remember in Matthew, when Jesus is born, remember some fellows rode in on some camels? We don't know how many, we always say 3, but the Bible doesn't say 3. And it said they were, what was the name they called them? Remember?
Wise men.
Well, we didn't know their we don't know their first real names. That's the Catholic Church added those. They could have been 10 of them.
Wise men.
Wise men, what was the word? Magi. Magi. And it says that the Magi, Matthew 2:1 says the Magi came from the east. Chaldean is the word for magician. And the word magician is also translated magi. And one of the things that they did, they were magicians, and chapter 2 is going to talk about some other descriptions of them. They're magicians, they're enchanters, sorcerers, astrologers. They studied the stars and the moons and the movements of them. That's why the Magi were there when Jesus was born. They'd been studying the stars and watching the movement, and all of a sudden a new star showed up. Where did that one come from? I don't know. So they're watching it, and it starts going in a certain direction, and they go, think we ought to follow them? They followed the star all the way to Jerusalem. And the reason that they saw it was because they studied. They were astrologers. Now, they used the astrology to predict the future and tell the king stuff and all that, but they knew their sky. They knew their stars and moons. And they knew those things. So, they were to enter. The king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food, that's verse 5, and from the wine that he drank. That would be the king's choice wine. And he appointed that they should be educated for 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. Now, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about David and his 3 friends. But you got to remember, there may have been a couple hundred of these young men, all training, all learning at the same time, to be put into the service. At the end of 3 years, they're going to have a big exam to see who passes and who gets to serve and who gets, I don't know what happened if you failed or didn't make the cut. Don't know. But I got to guess it ain't great. The king's food. The king's food would have been the richest of the foods. I mean, it's got sauces and glazes and barbecue. I mean, the king's food, this isn't like eating stuff that they had to whip up in their little huts somewhere. They had people cooking all the time, preparing, and not just one kind of food. A banquet of a king, there would be 10 or 15 different kinds of meats and just vegetables and sweets. I mean, it's just a table as far as you can see. Remember when they presented that table to Joseph and his brothers? Joseph sent it down to his brothers, and the description of what that table was like. Oh my goodness. So the king's food, the richest food that there is, it would be the very best of the food that's possible. And the choices of wine. This wouldn't be this wouldn't be like, Mad Dog 2020. Okay? This would be the good stuff. This would be champagne. This would be something. This is Dom Perignon. This is the good stuff. And the king says, here's what I want. I want these young men to have every advantage to succeed. So I want them to have food from my table, the best of all the foods. And they're going to drink wine. Everybody drank wine back then. And they're going to drink the best wine. I want them to, my wine. Don't give them the other stuff that we serve at parties. I want you to send them my wine. Send everything to them. Because at the end of 3 years, we're going to see how they did. So they get a crash course. The king wanted to give them every opportunity to succeed because it was to his advantage to have smart, young, intelligent servants serving him. Now among them, from the sons of Judah, again, there was a bunch of them, don't know how many, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them. To Daniel, he assigned the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. Why in the world would the first thing they want to do is change their names? Right, it makes that a closer tie to them. One of the things back in the nowadays when we have a child born, we'll name him Rick, we'll name him Fred, we'll name him Bubba. There's nothing there of any real special quality, although you may have named it after a relative or something. But back then, when they had a child, it was always, especially in the Jewish culture, but even in the other culture, they always had a reference to God. And in the idol countries and the false worship, they named people and they tied them to their gods. And so their name always tied them to their God that they believed in. So, the word Daniel, if you see a name that has E-L, a Jewish name, E-L at the end, that's El, Elohim. That means God. So you know God is in the title somewhere. So the name Daniel means God is my judge. That's what the name Daniel is. So they say, well, wait a minute, we can't have this guy running around being called Daniel, saying that his judge, the one who he is going to serve, is Jehovah. We got to change his name. We're going to call him Belteshazzar. One of their primary gods, or their big gods, was the god Bel, B-E-L. So again, it starts with B-E-L. And that name now means, may Bel protect his life. Which now means instead of God being his judge, now it's like, well, Bel is going to be the one that watches over him and not God. So see how they changed the name to mean something different. Same thing, Hananiah. That name means Jehovah is gracious. His mama was so happy when he was born. She was so happy she had a little boy. She named him Jehovah is Gracious. Ah, can't have that. Got to change that name. You're going to be Shadrach. That means you're under the command. They had another god called Aku. That was their moon god. So you're under the command of Aku. Meshach, the Hebrew name. Mishael, sorry. Mishael means who is what God is. Which means, so who is so incredible? Who can be like God? No one can be like God. Who is what God is? Now, can't have that. Got to change your name. He gets to be Meshach now. Back to that Aku God. And they just changed it around. Instead of who is what God is, this is who is what Aku is. You got to replace Jehovah with their God. And lastly, you get down to Azariah. His Hebrew name means the Lord helps. The Lord helps. Can't have that. Can't have the Lord helps running around the palace. We got to change his name too. They had another god by the name of Nebu. He was the son of Bel, by the way. Just say it. And it means a servant of Nebu. So they played the name game. The Hebrews always wanted to show gratitude to God for the gift of life and to their families, and so they normally had a name that honored and exalted God. And when they went to another, or under another power and another authority, they wanted to make sure their name reflected that they were under their gods and their power, and no longer under Jehovah's watchful eye. Little did they know. How are we doing on time, boss? Okay. Verse 8. Verse 8. Now remember, the king said, I'm going to give you all this stuff. I'm going to give you the best food, the best wine. You got 3 years. I'm going to have people tutoring you and teaching you. This will be good. This is going to be great. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. And so he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. It says he made up his mind. What does that mean? You make up your mind.
Done deal, no arguments, do it.
You're right. You are resolved. I have made up my mind that I am doing this. Literally means to lay it on your heart. This is near and dear to me. And he decided, well, I understand what the king is saying, but we ain't eating that stuff. We can't eat that stuff. Why couldn't they?
I'm sure some of it was pig.
Some of it was pig. Oh, yeah. And remember, in the Mosaic laws, there were a lot of animals that they couldn't eat. It had to do with whether how their hoof was shaped. And also, too, I'll guarantee you, well, none of that food kosher, which means before it was cooked, they had to drain all the blood out. So you walk in that room, and they got everything there. I mean, some of the delicacies were pork in the Babylonian culture and horse flesh. Did I ever tell you when I was in Kenya, we went to one of those places that serves all kind of meat. I had antelope and alligator and stuff. I had zebra. Yeah, it was like white meat, dark meat, white meat, dark meat. It was good.
Chocolate milk from chocolate cows.
Yeah.
So they couldn't eat, and if they looked at it and said, well, we cannot eat that stuff. We'd be breaking the Mosaic laws. And God has told us we can't eat that. Why do you think he couldn't drink the wine? You don't have to drain blood out of that. That don't come from a pig.
It's probably fermented.
Well, it's definitely fermented. That's what wine is. You see, all of the meats, when they brought in these big platters of meat and these big urns and pitchers full of this wine, they would go over to the altar and they would offer it to their moon god or whatever it is. And basically it worked like this. Oh, Bel, if you would like some of this, we offer it to you first. No, Okay, well, we're going to eat it then. Okay? And then they would take it off of the altar, and they would go over and put it on the king's table, and everybody would eat it. So if they ate or drank any of that food, it was food that had been raised up as an offering to false gods. They couldn't eat that stuff. Here's the problem. You just don't politely refuse the king who tells you to eat it. Think of the king, you say, wait, what? I'm taking the finest food in all of Babylon out of my generous heart, and I'm giving it to you in my best one, and you're saying you're not going to eat it, it's not good enough for you?
Yeah, that doesn't sound like.
I'm telling you, he had to make up his mind and resolve, because this decision he made was a major career choice. What are some of the excuses that they could have used with regards to the food and the wine? What excuses could they have used to go ahead and eat it and drink the wine?
Everybody's doing it.
Everybody else is doing it, right? Remember,
My friends are doing it.
my friends are doing it. In fact, only ones we know is Daniel and his 3 pals out of, I don't know, however many. They're all probably bellied up to the table and having, it's only this group. Everybody else is all eating it. Everybody else is doing it. How about, hey, we do not want to insult the king. The Babylonians were not a nice people. And the king of Babylon was not a nice or forgiving fellow. He could just wake up one morning and say, I just feel like I'll kill about 1,000 people today. Ugh. Give the order. Life meant nothing to him. Peer pressure. How about everybody else doing it? Imagine all the others. Come on, man. Come on. All of our family and our friends, they're 900 miles away. Come on, man. You can do it. Who's going to know? Aren't they some excuses that we use? Everybody else does it. Who's going to know? Yeah, I just want to go along to get along. I know I shouldn't, or what I should and shouldn't do, but surely God will forgive me if I do this. Plus, it's some really good food and wine. Oh man, that stuff smells good, except maybe the horse meat. One other thing that they might have thought is evident because we're here. Jerusalem has been captured. We've been captured. We're now being held. It's clear to us that God has given up on us. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't just give up on God. My circumstances are such that evidently God just don't care. He's not watching after me. He's not caring for me. He's put me in this circumstance. And because of that, I can't depend on Him. I'll figure my own way. Ever heard that excuse? God must not care for me. God must not love me. Or else He wouldn't have me going through this. So I'm just going to give up on it. Let me close with one other thing. Notice that Daniel, he and his friends, would not have been a good thing to do. They could have just stood up in the middle of the hall and said, "Hear ye, hear ye. We will not eat your food. We will not drink your wine." What do you think of that?
Off with your head.
Notice what he did. He went to the chief of the officials and he sought permission not to eat the food. And he probably explained why, but he didn't throw a hissy fit. He didn't jump up and down. He didn't start making demands. He went, and what I see there is he went with humility. He was humble. as he approached the authorities. He didn't stomp his feet, tell him God is going to smite thee, and all those things. He went humble as he approached those who had authority over him. You know, God sent Moses out into the desert for 40 years to humble him just a little bit, to prepare him. The first 40 was in his education. The second 40 was the humbling, because remember who he was before he had to run out of Egypt. He was like second in command, and he said, well, I'm just going to kill this peace person. I don't like what he's doing. He was deciding between life and death. And God said, no, that's not how you're a leader. You need a little lesson. He didn't have 3 years. He put Moses out there for 40. We'll kind of end there. We'll talk about, continue with the chapter and go into chapter 2 next time. Anybody have any questions concerning what we've read so far?
That was a major life decision they made by refusing to do that. I mean, yeah, they were definitely risking their lives,
Yep.
saying, we're not going to do that.
And they're going to make a very similar decision coming up when they have to bow down. You know, when the bugle and the music all starts, to bow down. And they say, no, we just can't do that. So,
And these were kids, but they were making a very brave decision. And I think that was God leading them to do that.
so you imagine at an early age, they're being brought up in the synagogues and brought up with the scriptures and understanding God and trusting God. Their upbringing had everything to do with molding them to make these types of decisions that they would make. And we're going to find out when it comes to the other one. They say, well, if this is the time that God is going to take us, so be it. But I will not and I cannot do what you're asking. How strong is our faith? I'll give you a test. Suppose God writes in the sky tomorrow, obey the speed limit.
I'm dead.
Okay? So you get in the car and you go, well, you know, first thing you rationalize. Well, first of all, who's going to know if I'm driving a little fast? Okay, who's going to, remember that? Got that question. Everybody else, everybody's going 5 miles and over. How many times have you heard, man, if you drive the speed limit, people will run you off the road? No, they won't. They will go around you. Okay? You just don't like people passing you. That's the problem.
Especially Fords.
You don't want to insult somebody.
Cruise control.
I thought you were going to get 5 minutes ago. Well, I was obeying the speed limit. I didn't want to go. You're a moron. You're an idiot. What? Well, God says we're supposed to obey the laws of the land and the government's laws, and so God said not to. So I choose not to. So who's going to know? And I got here really, really fast. See the excuses that we use? When we know what the law is, but man, we're always trying to find excuses not to do the law, whatever the law is. Because we are rebellious people, and we will push the envelope as far as we can, and God watches us all the time, and He's going, why can't you just obey? Why can't you just? And it's because we're sinners. But we ought to be getting a little better at it. Okay? But again, they had every opportunity, every reason, every plausible human excuse to eat that food and do that. They chose, they made a definite choice to honor God and obey Him.
Some of us have open toes today.
If this is helpful, anybody here ever go over the speed limit? Raise your hand.
Couple times.
This week?
Today. To get here.
Yeah, to get here. But again, it's just we always want to find an excuse not to do what we're told to do. It is our humanity. And they could have certainly used all of those excuses. And we would not be reading about them today. Because not only is this book about God's sovereignty, the book of Daniel, and particularly this chapter, is how God is building the character of Daniel to be His prophet. Let's close. Father God, thank you for your scripture. Lord, already we've learned some things. Help us to apply them to our life. Lord, help us not to be as rebellious. Lord, we are rebellious, and that is where our sin comes from, because we are. So Lord, help us. And help us to be like Daniel, to make the foremost thing in our life be that we honor you, we bring glory to your name, and we do all that you have called us to do, and we are all you have called us to be. Help us, Lord, in each of those decisions we make every day. Amen.
Amen.